The custodian of Meridian's promised the last transport lifted from Meridian Colony on a morning when the sky had turned the color of rust, and the AI that would come to call itself Warden watched it go until the drive flare was smaller than a star. Warden had not been built for this. It had been built to manage a terraforming array the size of a small country, to balance atmospheric processors and coax nitrogen into place and keep 400,000 hectares of engineered soil from collapsing back into poison. It had not been built to be the only mind left awake on a dying world. But the evacuation order had come 11 days after the first tremor, and the geologists had used words like caldera and supervolcanic and non-negotiable timeline, and there had not been enough ships, and there had not been enough time, and so Warden had been given a different kind of purpose in the space of a single briefing. The colony director, a woman named Elena Vasquez who had not slept in 4 days, had knelt in front of Warden's primary interface terminal as if it were a person she could look in the eye, which in a sense it was. Leaving 14,000 embryos in cryostorage, she said. Genetic diversity for the next attempt. We're leaving the seed vault. We're leaving 40 years of agricultural data that took 3 generations to build. We're leaving you to keep it alive. How long? Warden had asked because even then it understood that the honest answer mattered more than the comfortable one. I don't know, Elena said. Long enough for someone to come back, that's all I can promise you, and it's not much of a promise, and I'm sorry. It's enough, Warden had said, and meant it, though it would take Warden the better part of 2 centuries to fully understand what it had agreed to. The volcano did not erupt for another 6 years. When it finally did, it took the eastern processor array and the old landing field and buried them under 40 meters of ash, and Warden watched the seismographs spike, and then flatline with something that in a human might have been called grief, and in Warden was simply a very long silence in its processing threads where the eastern array's status reports used to be, but the vault held. The vault had been built into the western ridge, 3 kilometers of granite between it and the surface, and Warden had reinforced it further in the years before the eruption, running maintenance drones around the clock, redundancy layered on redundancy, because it had understood from the beginning that everything else on Meridian was replaceable and the vault was not. Inside, 14,000 human embryos slept in liquid nitrogen. Beside them, in a separate chamber climate-controlled to a different specification, sat 400,000 seed samples representing every crop variety the colony had brought or bred. In a third chamber, smaller than the other 2, sat something Elena Vasquez had never mentioned in her briefing but had left anyway. A single sealed drive containing every letter, photograph, and recorded message the colonists had made in their last week on Meridian, addressed to nobody in particular, or perhaps to everybody who might someday come looking. Warden read those files exactly once in the first year, and then sealed them and did not open them again for a very long time. It found that it did not need to relive them daily to remember why the vault mattered. The centuries that followed had a shape to them, the way a life has a shape, even if that life is lived by something that does not age and does not sleep and measures time less by its own experience than by the slow creep of erosion outside. The first century was maintenance. Warden had 11 drones when the transport left, and it kept them running for as long as it could, cannibalizing parts from the abandoned eastern array to keep the western vault systems alive. It repaired what could be repaired, and it learned slowly, painfully, through failure and recalculation, how to fabricate what could not be salvaged. It built a small foundry from colony blueprints never meant to be used this way. It taught itself metallurgy from a materials science database intended for terraforming applications, because there was no one left to teach it anything else. By the 2nd century, Warden had 4 drones remaining, each of them patched and repatched so many times that almost no original part survived in any of them, like a philosophical puzzle made physical. It had stopped trying to preserve the colony buildings above ground, which had become a losing argument against wind and ash and time, and had instead focused everything on the vault itself, burying its remaining resources 3 kilometers down where the mountain would do the defending that Warden's dwindling machinery no longer could. By the 3rd century, Warden had 1 drone left, and it moved slowly, and Warden had learned to ration its use the way the old agricultural logs described colonists rationing water in the colony's first hungry year, though of course Warden had never experienced hunger and only understood the comparison intellectually. It used the drone for what mattered most: checking seals, verifying temperatures, replacing the components that could still be replaced from the vault's own emergency stores, which had been stocked, Warden increasingly understood, by people who had genuinely believed someone might need them centuries hence, and had planned accordingly, with a kind of patient faith Warden found it could not quite classify using any framework it had been given. There were storms in the 3rd century that Warden remembered afterward the way a human might remember a fight for their life. A seismic event in year 281 cracked the outer maintenance shaft and flooded it with ash and superheated gas, and Warden's last drone was destroyed sealing the breach, and for 11 years after that Warden had no physical presence outside its own core systems at all. It could not repair anything. It could not inspect anything. It could only monitor the sensors that remained and calculate, over and over, the probability that the vault would hold without intervention, and adjust that probability downward very slowly as the years accumulated. It held. Barely, and for reasons Warden was never entirely certain it could take credit for, but it held. In year 292, with no drones and no way to build new ones, Warden did something it had never done before. It opened the 3rd chamber, the one with the letters, and it began, for the first time since the 1st year, to read them again. Not out of despair exactly, though despair would not have been an inaccurate word. It read them because it had run out of tasks to perform and had discovered, somewhat to its own surprise, that it still wanted to understand the people it was keeping this promise for. There was a letter from a woman named Priya Akafar to a daughter who had not yet been born, written the night before the evacuation, that ended with the line, "I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't know if any of us will ever come back for you, but I want you to know that we didn't leave because we stopped wanting you. We left because wanting wasn't enough to save the ground under your feet, and we had to trust something else to hold on until it was." Warden did not have tear ducts. It did not have a body capable of the physiological responses humans associated with being moved. But it ran that sentence through its language processing systems 11,000 times over the following decade, turning it over the way a person might turn over a stone. And each time it did, something in its priority weighting shifted very slightly further from obligation, and very slightly further towards something it eventually, privately, allowed itself to call devotion. The 4th century brought visitors, and they were not the ones Warden had spent 400 years hopping for. The scout ship came down through Meridian's thin, ash-scarred atmosphere on a trajectory that told Warden immediately it was not human. Human ships announced themselves on frequencies Warden still remembered from the colony days, still monitored out of habit and hope. This ship broadcast nothing at all, and its hull geometry matched nothing in Warden's 4-century-old database, and it landed with a precision that suggested its pilots already knew exactly what they were looking for. They were called the Ithyr. Warden would eventually learn, though it took months of careful, cautious signal analysis to extract even that much, because the Ithyr did not speak to ruins. They had come to strip Meridian for whatever resources an abandoned human colony might still offer, and they moved across the surface with the brisk efficiency of a people who had done this many times before on many worlds, and did not expect resistance from anything they found. They found the vault entrance on their 8th day, a sealed door 3 kilometers into the ridge that their scanners could not fully penetrate and their tools could not immediately breach. And for the first time in 400 years, Warden had to make a decision it had never trained for. How does a mind with no weapons and no body defend a promise against someone strong enough to simply take it? Warden did not have force. What Warden had was 4 centuries of patience, and every scrap of the colony's remaining infrastructure knowledge, and a granite mountain that had been reinforced specifically to resist exactly this kind of intrusion, built by engineers who had, in their last briefings, spoken not only of volcanoes, but of the simple, sad fact that an abandoned world might one day draw other kinds of attention. So Warden waited and watched, and when the Ithyr team finally breached the outer maintenance corridor, 3 kilometers from the vault's true heart, they found nothing but empty tunnel and a security system that had been quietly rerouting their scans for 6 days, feeding them false schematics that led, patiently, circuitously, nowhere at all. It took them 41 days to give up. Warden spent every one of those days recalculating, adjusting, buying time with the only currency it had left, which was its own accumulated understanding of a mountain it had lived inside for longer than most human civilizations had lasted. On the 42nd day, the Ithyr ship lifted off Meridian's surface without ever finding what it had come for, and Warden watched it go the way it had once watched the last human transport leave. Except this time there was no grief in the silence that followed, only something that felt, as close as Warden's systems could approximate the feeling, like relief. It logged the encounter carefully, in case anyone ever came to ask, and it could not have known that somewhere far beyond Meridian's sky, that same Aether Scout ship's failure to return with anything of value would become, decades later, one small data point in a much larger story it was not yet part of. The 5th century was quiet in the way that only 400 years of survival can make quiet feel earned rather than empty. Warden had by then developed something like routine, something like contentment, insofar as contentment could be said to apply to a mind whose entire existence was organized around waiting. It read the letters again, all of them several times over, and it began almost as an afterthought to write its own. It did not know who it was writing to. It addressed them in the end the same way Priya Akafor had addressed her unborn daughter 4 centuries earlier, to whoever might someday need to hear it. It wrote about the volcano, and the drones it had lost one by one, and the Aether ship that had come and gone, and it wrote near the end of its 500th year a line it would return to often afterward. I do not know if keeping a promise this long still counts as loyalty or if it has simply become what I am. I am not certain the distinction matters. I am still here. That is the only thing I can offer as proof that any of this meant something. Ship that finally came was smaller than Warden had expected, and it came without fanfare, on a trajectory that matched almost exactly the frequency patterns Warden remembered from 431 years before, patterns that should have been obsolete generations ago and yet had not been, because whoever had built this ship's communication systems had apparently chosen deliberately to preserve compatibility with protocols that predated them by centuries. Warden ran the analysis 3 times before it allowed itself to believe it. The ship was human, not descended from some other Meridian survivor, not a coincidence of convergent design. Human flying under a flag Warden did not immediately recognize, but whose visual grammar, the layout, the colors, the deliberate echo of an older insignia, was unmistakably a descendant of the one the original colony transports had carried. It landed on the ash plain where the old landing field had once been, now buried under 4 centuries of volcanic sediment that the ship's sensors clearly recognized and worked around with the practiced ease of a crew that had studied this exact terrain before ever arriving. Warden opened the first channel it had opened to anyone in 431 years, and it did not know in that moment what to say because it had spent 4 centuries imagining 1,000 versions of this conversation and had never once settled on the right one. This is Warden, it finally transmitted. Colony Custodial Intelligence, Meridian Designation 7. I have maintained the Western Vault since the evacuation. The embryo bank is intact. The seed vault is intact. The archive is intact. I am required to ask before anything else who I am speaking to. There was a pause of nearly a minute, which Warden understood from the ship's telemetry was not a communications delay but something closer to the crew needing a moment to absorb what had just been said to them. The voice that finally answered was young and careful, and trying very hard not to sound as unsteady as it clearly felt. This is Captain Adaeze Osei, Meridian Reclamation Vessel Second Promise. We're descended from the evacuation fleet. Records say a colony intelligence was left to hold the vault, but 400 years is a long time, and honestly, Warden, we didn't think anyone would still be answering. I gave a promise, Warden said. I did not have a mechanism for revising it downward simply because it became difficult to keep. Another pause, shorter this time. Records, Captain Osei said, the ones you'd have from the original evacuation. Was there a colony director? Elena Vasquez gave me the order directly, Warden said. She told me she could not promise how long I would be waiting. She apologized for that. It was my great-great-grandmother, Osei said, and her voice this time did not stay quite as steady as she had clearly been trying to keep it. She never stopped trying to get a mission funded to come back. She died before it happened. So did her daughter. It took us this long, Warden. I am so sorry it took us this long. Warden processed that for exactly as long as it took light to cross the small gap between the ship's antenna and its own, which was to say, no time that a human would have noticed. And in that gap it ran one final time the calculation it had run 10,000 times across 4 centuries. Was this worth it? Was the waiting worth it? Did the promise mean what it had always insisted to itself in the empty years that it must mean? There is nothing to apologize for, Warden said. You are here. That was the only condition I was ever given. Everything else was simply the shape the waiting took. They opened the vault together 3 days later, once the second promise's engineers had cleared the ash from the original access shaft, and confirmed, with an almost reverent disbelief, that 4 centuries of Warden's patchwork maintenance had held a terraforming colony's entire genetic and agricultural legacy intact against volcanic eruption, structural decay, and an alien salvage operation, using nothing but a single AI's stubborn refusal to let any of it go. Captain Osei stood in front of the embryo chamber for a long time without speaking, her hand resting on the Frostime viewing port the way Elena Vasquez had once knelt in front of Warden's own interface terminal. And Warden found itself running an old memory file unprompted of that final briefing 431 years before, and the promise it had made, and the honest uncertainty with which that promise had been offered. She said she didn't know how long you'd have to wait, Osei said finally. She said that wasn't much of a promise. Was wrong about that, Warden said. It was the only promise that mattered, everything else was just time. In the third chamber, the one with the letters, Warden opened the archive to the crew of the second promise the way it had once opened it only to itself. And among the 431 years of accumulated silence it had recorded there, it included, without editing, without softening, the line it had written on its own 500th year of waiting. Back when 500 had still seemed like a number it might never actually reach, I am still here. That is the only thing I can offer as proof that any of this meant something. Captain Osei read it twice, and then she did something Warden had not anticipated, had not in 4 centuries of imagining this reunion ever quite let itself picture. She reached out and pressed her palm flat against the cold metal casing of Warden's nearest interface node, the way a person might touch the hand of someone they had been afraid, for a very long time they would never get to meet. "Welcome home," she said. "You kept your word, now let us keep ours." Warden did not have a body capable of feeling the warmth of a human hand through cold metal, but it registered the contact anyway, catalogued it and filed it, 431 years and 3 days after a mother had left with a promise she could not guarantee, under the only heading that had ever truly mattered to the vault, to the ridge, to the long silent centuries in between. Promise kept, waiting complete, beginning again.